I've been very disappointed had I come all the way from North Carolina and not see your bright, smiling faces. This is something that Brother Malcolm would have loved if he could have been here today. He was always happy, or happiest, when he had an audience of young people like you to talk with, to address, and to give you the benefit of his wisdom and the things that he had experienced during his lifetime. Whenever I'm here in this place, I'm always reminded of the afternoon that we had gathered here to have Brother Malcolm speak to us. About 500 or 600 people were in the audience when Malcolm came out on the stage, and I was one of the people who was there that day and witnessed that sad occasion. I believe this space has been changed. Directly, what is it down here? Right here, what is it? Right here. Good. Okay, the stage is right. Okay, I got it. Okay. The brother here is directly. He is not going to let you make any mistakes. But the stage was, of course, here, and Malcolm was in a side room and was being introduced by one of the brothers in the club, in the organization, the OAAU, Brother Benjamin, as a matter of fact. And Malcolm, or rather when Brother Benjamin had reached a point in his introduction that was a signal for Malcolm to come out on stage, he walked out from the side room there, came across the stage, and sat down somewhere behind the roster. There were two people on the stage. So Brother Benjamin, who was introducing Malcolm, and there was Brother Malcolm himself. There were several chairs on the stage. We had invited some people to be on the stage that day with Brother Malcolm. But none of them had shown up, and nobody knew what had happened. But Malcolm came out anyway, and Brother Benjamin said, he began to wind up his introduction of Malcolm, and he said, and now I'm going to introduce to you a brother who would give up his life for you. And Malcolm stood up, and Benjamin turned to go sit down and take the chair that Malcolm had just given up. And Malcolm stopped him and whispered something in his ear, and Benjamin nodded his head, walked off the stage, down the stairs, and began to walk to the back of the room. Later on, I was able to ask Benjamin what was it that Malcolm had said to him. He said that Malcolm had said to him, Benjamin, when you come off the stage, don't sit down, but go in the back. There's a payphone. Call this number and ask for this brother and find out why he isn't here. And Benjamin nodded and went off the stage, leaving Malcolm on the stage alone. Now, before I go any further, I want you to know that most of you probably know this, that our organization had been going through some difficult time at that period of time. That Malcolm X had been dismissed from the Nation of Islam and had formed two organizations of his own. The Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which I was a member of, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And that was an organization I was a member of. And so, our organization had been having difficulty because the problems that Malcolm had had begun to affect our organization. And although there were 5, maybe 600 or 700 people there that day, we were having difficulty getting people, members to join the organization because so many people were afraid of Malcolm and the problems he was having with the Nation of Islam. And they felt that Malcolm was at a point in time in his life where his life wasn't worth very much. That people were trying to kill Malcolm. And that people who came to these meetings that we held, it was a risk that you took because you never knew what was going to happen. But Malcolm was always in a position to want to talk to people, to share his information and his knowledge with the people who came to hear him talk. And so he never disappointed an audience that came out to hear him. Whatever the circumstances were, Malcolm was always prepared to go ahead and share his information with them. This particular day, though, there was a plot that had developed where some people, some men who did not like Malcolm, who didn't understand what he was trying to tell us as black people, to give us information that would help us to solve some of the problems that we were having with this country, with this United States, this vicious, terrible enemy. So when Malcolm got up to speak, as he stood before the audience and gave his usual greeting, he said, "Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters." And the audience answered. At that moment, over in the crowd, and they would have been seated about where you all seated there. The sisters at right. 2 men stood up and knocked over their chairs. And one of them said, "Get your hand out of my pocket." And he backed off like this and had his hand on his pocket. And the other guy was approaching him and saying something. And Malcolm stepped out from the roster, stepped out from the speaker like this. And he leaned over and he said, "Cool it, brothers and sisters." That's all he said. And he straightened up. And as he did that, his hand came up like this. There was a loud explosion. Boom! And later we found out that it was a shotgun blast. A double-barrel shotgun had been fired at point-blank range into Malcolm's chest. It struck his heart. And I believe that that shot killed him right then and there on the spot. But Malcolm didn't fall. When he straightened up like this, bullets began to rain out, all sorts of guns, pistols, shotguns, and Malcolm stood there with his hand raised, and then after a few seconds, he fell over backwards. He didn't crumple, his knees didn't bend, he didn't fall to the side, he just fell straight backwards. And the bullets were raining out so, and I was sitting in my seat watching. And I'm saying, well, if they would stop shooting, maybe Malcolm would survive. But when he fell backwards, the back of his head hit the stage, like that. And I said, uh-oh. Even if he survives all of these gunshot wounds, the fact that Malcolm was about 6'2" or 6'3" inches tall and fell over backwards and nothing caught him. The back of his head hit the floor with a loud thud. And I said, well, that would have to kill him. The bullets didn't. That would burst his brains. Anyway, Malcolm fell over backwards, and there was a silence for a few minutes. And then the gunshot started up again. A fusillade of shots. And it was obvious that somebody at the front of the stage, or in the front of the audience, was firing bullets into Malcolm's prone body. And this went on for a few seconds. It seemed like almost for hours, but it was only a few seconds. And then the shooting stopped. And by that time, I was still watching what was going on, trying to find out, get some idea of what was happening to Malcolm and who was doing this to him. People who were at that, around that area, they were sitting in a booth at a table, and they began to pull me down and say, get under the table here with us, Brother Herman. And they pulled me under the table. And I went in feet first with my head out in the aisle so I could still continue to see what was going on. The bullets had stopped. The shooting had stopped. Malcolm was lying there on the floor. Obviously, no life left in his body. He hadn't made a move since the time he had straightened up and then went over backwards. He hadn't moved at all. What had happened is that a team of people had planned to assassinate Malcolm. And the way they set it up was that two of the assassins would pretend that they were going to have they would start some commotion and direct Malcolm's security people who were around the stage from what was happening to Malcolm so that the men who were seated in the front row could stand up and then do what they were supposed to do. And that part of the tragedy took place as they had planned. The commotion took place. Every eye in that audience immediately turned to those two men who had committed this commotion. And nobody was paying any attention to Malcolm because we had never had anything like this happen. And we had before, and we had several public meetings where Malcolm was the featured speaker. So it just never occurred to any of us that anyone would dare interfere with anything that Malcolm was doing. But this was something that these guys had planned. And they were prepared to carry it out. And nobody could stop it. So when the shooting stopped, by this time, I was lying on the floor looking up, and I could see that people had started throwing chairs over, trying to escape, trying to get on the tables. Sister Betty and her children were seated over on this side of the floor. And so there was pandemonium, and everybody knew that something terrible had happened. But nobody really knew what had happened and what was going on. And all we knew was that Brother Malcolm had been hurt and was probably dead. And then people came out of their hiding places from underneath the chairs and tables. People began to run up on the stage to try and help Malcolm, to revive him or do something to help him. And what I saw at that point in time were three men who were obvious part of the assassination team. They were standing in the center aisle, three men, one behind the other, and one of them had some kind of a weapon in his hand. holding it at his side. It was very quiet. You could have heard the proverbial pin fall. You could hear a pin that fall. It was so quiet at that time. Those three men stood there, and then, as though a signal had been given, they began to jump over people who were sprawled all around the floor and run back toward the rear. And as they reached the rear door, almost to the door, some shots rang out again. And we learned later on that one of Malcolm's security men, who had defied Malcolm's order that no security people were to be armed, were to bring any weapons, this brother brought his weapon because he just sensed the danger that Malcolm was in, and he wanted to be able to do something about it. And so when these three men started running to the rear, this brother, Reuben Francis, remember his name, Reuben Francis, a very important man, he fired at these men who were running, and he hit one of the guys in his leg. And incidentally, the guy that he hit in the leg, when he continued to run out the door, the people who were outside caught up with him because he had a bullet wound in his leg and he couldn't run very fast. And they were holding on to him and trying to pulling his arms and legs off him. The police came up and they were trying to rescue this man. And the only way they could get him away from the crowd was to fire their pistols in the air. And the crowd fell back, and the police caught this man, put him in their car, their police car, and drove away. This man was,
Thomas Haven,
Thomas Haven.
a.k.a. Thomas Haven.
And he is a guy who has done how many years? 45 years. And just recently, the parole board released him and freed him. And he's now free after 40 some odd years. They let him go. No one understands the thinking of the parole board.
It's worse than that. Hagen, after 11 years, or 15 years, Hagen was put on work release program. All right, Hagen, 22 years ago, was put on a work release program, which meant that he spent 2 days in one of these halfway houses in Manhattan, and 5 days at home with his family. I worked it out, he spent only 11 years in full custody for the murder of our leader,
Yes, sir.
of our black shining prince, if you want to use that word. As far as I'm concerned, the assassination of Malcolm X, for us, equals the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I wonder if this government would ever have released the murderer of Kennedy after 11 years, or even after 40 years, and they released the murder of Malcolm X. But everyone talks about he spent 45 years in prison. No, he didn't. He only spent 11 of those years in full custody. The rest of the time, the brother was at home with his family. On the weekends, he went to a halfway house.
And not in prison.
Not in prison.
That's right.
No,
That's right.
not in prison. A halfway house around somewhere. I don't know which one it was. And that was in New York. You know, he had a job and he had a family life. I find that, for me, it's the ultimate slap in the face of our people.
Yes, sir.
For me, it was the ultimate desecration of a great life and of a people and their struggle. To say that you murdered this man in front of his wife and children, his pregnant wife and children. You did this, and all you got was 11 years? No. The whole story of Thomas Hayden is a desecration and an insult
That's right.
to us. One of the many things, we talk about many things, that was one of them. And I'm not going to forget, and I don't want you to forget, that the life of a leader, of a black man who was a leader of his people, was worth so little. They'll talk about, and I'm not going to go into the political thing, but every time one of our brothers comes up for parole, he doesn't get parole because of the heinous nature of the crime, they say. Well, what's more heinous than shooting down a man in cold blood in front of 600 people and in front of his pregnant wife and young children, 4 young children? What's more heinous than that? Unless you say what's more heinous is that he was the head of a nation of black people and you murdered him in front of 500-600 of his citizens and compatriots.
He was the only leader in whom I had any confidence. I came along at the height of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was the leader of that movement. I went to the March on Washington where Martin Luther King spoke about I Have a Dream. And I didn't know what he was talking. I was a Malcolm follower. I believed in the things that Malcolm believed in. I felt that if anyone had an answer to our problem as black people in this United States and in the world, Malcolm was the person who would have that solution to the problem. And I was prepared to follow him wherever he lived. And that's why after Malcolm was assassinated, I felt that it was my obligation to attempt to carry his message as far and as wide as I could carry it, and do some of the things that he had taught us that needed to be done